Yeah, it tells me that there was a high degree of control over her. I mean, think about this. What it would take to hide these kids, to fly under the radar for this long. Is it something that Elizabeth did by herself? Hard to believe. It seems like it was more of a system that was designed by the husband and the in laws. They had it down to a routine. So I find it hard to believe that she herself was the sole motivation behind these activities.
Here are two sentences about the same woman. At 15 years old, she was driven across a state line, 7 months pregnant, and married to a grown man in a courthouse, a child by any measure, handed into a marriage. At 33 years old, she was booked into a jail cell, charged with 16 counts of endangering the 16 children she gave birth to inside that marriage. Same woman, Elizabeth Siders, and the entire future of this case may come down to a question that sounds impossible until you sit with it. Can both of those sentences be fully true at the same time? Can a person be a victim and a perpetrator, not one and then the other, but both at once, in the same body, in the same house? This week, Elizabeth's own attorney filed a motion that forces the court to confront exactly that. And a forensic psychiatrist laid out, in careful clinical terms, how the same set of facts about this woman can be assembled into two completely opposite stories. One where she is among the most sympathetic figures in this entire case, and one where she is fully responsible for what happened to those children. Tonight, we are going to walk through both of those stories, not to decide which is true. A jury may spend a year on that, and neither you nor I have examined anyone in this family, but because the space between those two stories is where this case now lives. Before we go further, this episode deals with child marriage, abuse, and the neglect of children. I won't show them, name the kids, or describe conditions for shock. But if this is heavy for you, take care of yourself while watching. If you're new here, this is Quiet Record. Verified reporting, named experts, nothing invented. Subscribe if that's what you want. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And to everyone who's followed this case across 7 episodes, you're the reason it's still being asked about. Thank you. Because tonight the case narrows down from a house, a county, and 4 defendants to a single person and a single question. Was Elizabeth Siders a victim, a perpetrator, or somehow both? Let's start with the motion, because it's the document that put this question in front of a judge. This week, Elizabeth's attorney filed for a competency evaluation, the same request the other 3 defendants have made. But he attached something the others did not, at least not in the same breath. He asked that if Elizabeth is found competent to stand trial, she then be evaluated for a defense of not guilty by reason of insanity. And the language he used is worth hearing precisely, because it is the entire case in a paragraph. He wrote that her mental health issues would not only affect whether she is competent today, but would also have affected her ability to understand the wrongfulness of her conduct at the time of the alleged offenses. Understand the wrongfulness of her conduct. That is not casual phrasing. That is the exact legal standard for insanity in Ohio, a mental illness or defect that left the person unable to appreciate that what they were doing was wrong. He went further. He wrote that she would not have fully understood the consequences of her actions. He wrote that he had met with her on numerous occasions and for extended periods, and that watching her demeanor and comprehension across those meetings led him to believe she may be suffering from significant mental illness. And then he did something telling. He offered to explain his specific concerns directly to the judge privately, rather than put them in a public filing. That's the same close-to-the-vest move Gary Jr.'s team made, but sit with what it implies. Whatever this attorney has seen across his hours with Elizabeth, he considers it serious enough to build an insanity defense on, and private enough that he does not want it in the public record. He is, in his own words, still in the dark about much of the evidence because there is no indictment yet. He is building this on what he has seen with his own eyes, sitting across a table from her. So the defense has drawn its map. The question is whether the territory matches it. And to understand the 2 ways this story can be told, you have to start with the people who knew her before any of this. Her brothers. Because Elizabeth Siders has brothers on the outside and they have not stayed quiet. The most striking is a man named Jeremy Russell. And what makes his post remarkable is not that he defends the family, it's that he splits it in two. Jeremy has posted publicly that he believes the other three defendants are performing their incompetency. His words, he doesn't think his sister would play dumb, but the rest of the family, in his phrasing, is playing goofy. Read that again, because it's extraordinary. Here's a family member drawing a line straight down the middle of this case. His sister on one side, the grandparents, and her husband on the other. The others are faking, he says. Elizabeth is not. And his account of her is not one of a mastermind. It's one of a captive. He wrote that his sister was brainwashed, that the mother, meaning Christina, the mother-in-law, coached my sister to stay away, that Elizabeth believed she was in good hands and thought she was doing the right thing. On the day of the arrest, he posted that his sister wrapped her life up due to indoctrination and called it 100% real. He described watching her lose touch with her own family over 15 years, pulled into another one. Then there is a second brother, and his account is darker still. On a live video, he said that he and Elizabeth were badly beaten and abused as children in the home they grew up in, and he suggested something that, if true, reframes the very beginning of this story, that Elizabeth may have gotten pregnant at 15, in part to get out of that house. Think about what that would mean. It would mean the marriage we've spent an entire episode calling a tragedy was, from her side, an escape. A 15-year-old trading one bad situation for another she couldn't yet see. It would mean she went from a house she was beaten in to a house she'd spend the next 18 years unable to leave. I want to be careful. This is a brother's claim made on a live stream, and it is not documented in any court record I've seen. But it is on the table now, and it is the kind of claim that, if a defense can substantiate it, becomes the first chapter of a very different story about who Elizabeth Siders is. Two brothers, both in their own way, describing a sister who was acted upon. And that is exactly the story a forensic psychiatrist says the defense is likely to build. If you've been with this case, this is where I ask the one thing that keeps this channel doing what it does. What comes next? The actual psychology of how a person can be trapped in plain sight, free to walk out a door they are psychologically unable to walk through, is the part that separates real understanding of this case from a comment section verdict. It's the part that matters. Subscribing is how you keep coverage like this in your feed. One tap. Then stay with me, because this is where the two stories finally split apart. The forensic psychiatrist is Dr. Daniel Bober, and he has been careful, every time, to say he has not examined Elizabeth Siders and cannot diagnose her. What he can do is explain the framework, the lens through which a defense would ask a jury to see her. The lens has a name, coercive control, and underneath it sits a well-known psychological phenomenon that Bober named directly, battered woman syndrome. He was precise that this is not an official diagnosis in the manual psychiatrists use. It is a description of a pattern, observed again and again in people trapped in abusive, controlling relationships. And it is the clinical answer to the question everyone in the comments is already typing: why didn't she just leave? Here is the answer, and it is not an excuse. It is a mechanism. Bober described three pieces of it. The first is learned helplessness. When a person is trapped long enough, punished enough for trying, they stop believing there is any way out at all. The exits may be real, but the person has been conditioned to no longer see them. The second is trauma bonding, a psychological dependence on the very person harming you, where the abuser becomes the source of both the fear and the comfort, and leaving feels like losing the only anchor you have. The third is hypervigilance, living in a constant state of scanning for threat, so consumed by managing the danger in front of you that planning an escape becomes impossible. Now apply that to a specific human being, a girl married at 15, before her brain was finished developing, before she had a driver's license, before she'd ever lived as an adult. Pregnant immediately, and again, for 18 years, with no gap long enough to catch her breath. Cut off, her brothers say, from her own family. Living inside a household her brother describes as one that coached her, and kept her isolated. Bober's point is that you cannot evaluate the choices of a person in that position the way you'd evaluate the choices of a free adult, because the machinery that lets a free adult say, "This is wrong, I'm leaving," may have been dismantled in her before she was old enough to use it. The prosecution, Bober said, will tell the exact same facts as a completely different story. She could have left. She could have asked for help. She was an adult for the last 15 of those 18 years. 16 children lived in filth in a room, and whatever was done to her, she had a fundamental duty not to let that happen to them. That duty does not evaporate because your own life was hard. Plenty of people survive terrible childhoods and terrible marriages without letting 16 children come to harm. That is the prosecution's story, and it is not a weak one. It is, in fact, the law's default position. Adults are responsible for the children in their care. Full stop. And here is the hard truth Bober named that neither side's supporters want to hear. Same facts. Two stories. And the facts alone don't choose between them. This case, he said, will come down to a battle of the experts, dueling clinicians, each assembling the same history into opposite conclusions about how much of what Elizabeth did was choice and how much was the residue of what was done to her. That battle is the case now. There is one piece of evidence, though, that tilts the table, and it isn't testimony. It's a Facebook post from 2014. The post came from Gary Jr.'s account, but it was written as if it were Elizabeth speaking. It said, in effect, "This is Elizabeth, and if you have pictures of me on social media, take them down." Bober's read was immediate, and once you hear it, hard to shake. "You and I have been around long enough," he said, "to know that a woman was almost certainly not logging into her husband's Facebook account to announce, 'This is Elizabeth, remove all photos of me.'" What that post far more likely shows is a husband on his own account speaking for her, controlling her image, her visibility, her presence in the outside world, and doing it in her name. It is a small thing, a decade-old status update. But it is the kind of small thing that expert testimony is built from, a documented, time-stamped fragment suggesting that years before those children were found, someone else was already controlling how Elizabeth Siders was allowed to appear to the world. The defense will hold that post up and say, "This is what control looks like, on the record, in 2014. Multiply it by 18 years. And it raises a question this case has never actually answered, one that sits underneath the victim-perpetrator debate and makes it stranger. Why hide the children at all? Not how. Why? What does a household get out of keeping 16 kids invisible for years? Bober walked through the possibilities, and none of them are comfortable. One is paranoia, a genuine clinical fear of government institutions, of being watched, of the outside world reaching in to take something away. Families like this have existed. A distrust of authority curdles into a belief that any contact with a school, a doctor, an agency is a threat. Another is a shared delusion, where one dominant person's distorted view of the world becomes the whole household's reality, and everyone inside it comes to believe the same suspicious, closed-off story about why the outside can't be trusted. And the third possibility is the bleakest and the simplest, control for its own sake. That some people isolate others because the isolation itself is the point. Because keeping a person or a household dependent, invisible, and yours produces a kind of gratification. No paranoia required, just power. Why this matters for Elizabeth specifically is the direction of the control. If the isolation was driven by paranoia or delusion or appetite belonging to the husband and the in-laws, if the system, as Bober put it, was designed by them and she was inside it rather than running it, then she starts to look less like an architect of that house and more like its longest-serving resident. Bober said it plainly. What it would take to hide these children, to fly under the radar for this long, is hard to believe as the work of one person acting alone. It reads, he said, like a system with a routine, and systems have designers. The question the jury will have to answer is whether Elizabeth was one of them or one more thing the system controlled. So if the coercive control story is that strong, why isn't this simple? Why isn't Elizabeth obviously a victim and the case against her weak? Because the law does not work the way sympathy works. And this is where the defense's own strategy runs into a wall. Start with the insanity defense itself, the one her attorney is reaching for. Bober was blunt about how high that bar sits. In Ohio, to be found not guilty by reason of insanity, the defense has to prove, and the burden is on them, by a preponderance of the evidence, that because of a mental illness or defect, Elizabeth was unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of her conduct. Not that she was mentally ill, not that she was suffering, that she genuinely could not understand that what was happening was wrong. And Bober noted something that cuts against the defense before it starts. The insanity defense is usually associated with acts of force, a person in a psychotic break who commits violence, not with child neglect that unfolds slowly, over years. Neglect is a strange fit for insanity because insanity is about a moment of not knowing, and neglect is 1,000 small choices across a decade. Then there is the deeper problem, the same one that haunts every defendant in this case, and it applies to Elizabeth too. An insanity defense says, I didn't know it was wrong, but the state's entire theory is that this family hid these children. Concealment. And concealment is the enemy of an insanity defense, because you do not hide what you don't know is wrong. Bober said it plainly. The counterargument to any insanity claim here is that the attempts to fly under the radar, to keep the children out of sight, show a consciousness of guilt. Some part of the household knew this had to be kept from the world. The hiding proves the knowing. Now, a defense could argue that Elizabeth, specifically, was not the one doing the hiding, that the concealment was run by the husband and the in-laws, and that she was as controlled as the children were. That is a real argument. But it lands her in a strange middle place, and Bober named it, "You can be mentally ill and still be competent." You can be mentally ill and still be criminally responsible. Mental illness by itself is not a defense. A jury could believe every word about the coercive control, believe she was a victim, and still convict her, because being a victim does not, under the law, erase the duty she owed those 16 children. That is the trap this case sets, and it is genuinely agonizing. The more the defense proves that Elizabeth was controlled, isolated, and psychologically trapped, the more sympathetic she becomes, and the less that sympathy may legally matter. Victimhood explains why she didn't leave. It does not, on its own, excuse what the children endured while she stayed. So can both sentences be true? Can she be victim and perpetrator at once? The honest answer, legally, is yes, and the law has almost no comfortable place to put a person who is both. A jury will not be asked, was she a victim? It will be asked, is she guilty of child endangering? And a person can be genuinely, provably a victim of 2 decades of coercive control and still be guilty of that, because the charge is about what happened to the children, not what happened to her. The victimhood may reduce her moral culpability in the eyes of the public, and it may, if the defense fights well, reduce her sentence, or move a prosecutor toward a plea. What it likely cannot do is make the 16 counts disappear. Both things can be true, and the person caught in the overlap tends to lose anyway. Her own attorney, notably, has said publicly that Elizabeth does not consider herself a victim. Sit with that too. The defense is building a victim framework around a woman who may not accept the label, which is itself, some would argue, one of the most recognizable features of coercive control, the inability to name what was done to you as harm. Or, the prosecution would counter, simply an adult who knows what she did and isn't hiding behind an excuse. Same fact. 2 stories, again. Which is why Bober kept returning to that one phrase, a battle of the experts, because it describes exactly how this gets resolved, and it isn't the way most people imagine. There will not be a single moment where the truth about Elizabeth Siders is revealed. Instead, if this reaches trial, the defense will call clinicians who have examined her and will testify that coercive control robbed her of the capacity to act freely. The prosecution will call its own clinicians, who will examine the same woman and the same history and testify that she understood exactly what she was doing and chose it. 12 jurors with no clinical training will then be asked to decide which set of experts to believe. That is the machinery. The verdict on whether Elizabeth was a victim will not come from a diagnosis. It will come from whichever expert is more persuasive to a jury in Vinton County. And there's a practical layer underneath the courtroom drama that may matter even more. The prosecutor in this case has already brought on special prosecutors to help carry it. And prosecutors, when they look at a defendant who is genuinely sympathetic, a woman married off at 15, arguably a victim herself, sometimes make a calculation that has nothing to do with the maximum sentence. They ask what a jury will actually do. A jury that hears 18 years of coercive control may be reluctant to convict Elizabeth on all 16 counts, or may convict but recoil at a long sentence. That reluctance is leverage. It is the kind of thing that moves a case toward a plea, a negotiated resolution where Elizabeth pleads to some of the charges in exchange for others being dropped, and everyone avoids the risk of a trial. If Elizabeth is the defendant most likely to be seen as a victim, she may also be the defendant most likely to be offered a deal. Her victimhood, in other words, may never be decided by a jury at all. It may simply become a bargaining chip. That is the unglamorous reality of how a case like this often ends. Not in a dramatic verdict on the deepest human question, but in a negotiated document that leaves the question permanently open. Was she a victim? The law may decide it never has to answer. And before we close, there is a group this entire conversation risks forgetting, and I don't want to be one more voice that does. Everything we've discussed tonight, coercive control, learned helplessness, the battle of the experts, the plea math, is about the adults. It is about Elizabeth's mind, Elizabeth's history, Elizabeth's culpability. It is a genuinely important conversation, but it is not the only one, and it cannot be allowed to swallow the other. Because whatever is true about Elizabeth Siders, 16 children lived in that house. And their experience does not become less real because their mothers may also have been terrible. A child who cannot speak at an age when speech should have come. A child whose growth may have been stunted by the environment itself. 16 young people who are now scattered across foster homes, some of whom may spend years, or the rest of their lives, recovering from what happened inside those walls. Their suffering is not a debate. It is the fixed point around which every other question in this case orbits. The law understands this, even when public sympathy wobbles. The reason a victim can also be a perpetrator, the reason those two sentences can both be true, is precisely that the duty to a child does not bend to the hardship of the adult who owes it. It is one of the few places the law refuses to blur. You can be the most sympathetic defendant imaginable and still be answerable for a child left in harm's reach, because the child's right to safety does not depend on their caretaker's luck. That is not cruelty toward Elizabeth. It is the system finally, belatedly, putting a child's welfare first, the exact thing that did not happen for her at 15 and did not happen for those 16 for years. So when we ask whether Elizabeth was a victim, we have to hold the other question in the same hand. Whatever she was, 16 children needed someone to protect them, and no one in that house did. Both truths, again at once. The overlap is where the whole case lives, and it is where these children were lost. So here, as of this recording, is the honest ledger. What is true? Elizabeth Siders' attorney filed for a competency evaluation and, if she is found competent, an evaluation for a not guilty by reason of insanity defense, writing that her mental illness may have affected her ability to understand the wrongfulness of her conduct. He offered to detail his concerns privately to the judge. Her brother Jeremy Russell has publicly stated he believes she was brainwashed and indoctrinated, while accusing the other three defendants of faking incompetency. A second brother stated on a live video that he and Elizabeth were abused as children. A 2014 Facebook post from Gary Jr.'s account spoke in Elizabeth's name, asking that her photos be removed. All four defendants are presumed innocent and have pleaded not guilty. What is theory, whether Elizabeth was a victim of coercive control, a framework a forensic psychiatrist described but explicitly did not diagnose, having never examined her, battered woman syndrome, which is not a formal diagnosis, the second brother's abuse claim, which is not in any court record, and whether any of this reduces her legal culpability, which a jury or a plea will decide. What is invention? Any claim that Elizabeth has been diagnosed with anything. No evaluation has occurred. Any assertion that she definitely was, or definitely was not, a victim. That is precisely the question no one has answered. And, as the reporter covering this case confirmed, there is no documented evidence of sexual abuse in this case so far. Anyone stating otherwise is inventing it. Slowly closing, and whether the law can tell the difference. Here's the part I can't stop turning over. The state of Ohio, in 2008, was the same state that would not let Elizabeth marry at 15, so her family drove her across a border to a state that would. No one stopped that car. No agency asked why a pregnant child was becoming a wife. The systems that are now preparing to try her as a fully responsible adult are the same systems that watched her stop being a child and looked away. That does not decide whether she is guilty. 16 children were harmed, and that fact sits at the center of this, no matter what was done to their mother. But it should complicate the easy version of this story, the one where Elizabeth Siders is simply a monster, or simply a victim. She may be a person the law helped fail at 15, and then charged at 33 for the wreckage of the life that failure led to. Both sentences, true at once. The overlap is the whole tragedy. This channel will follow it to the end. The competency reports, the battle of the experts, the moment a jury or a plea deal finally decides which story the law will accept. Not for the outrage, for the follow-through. If you want to be there when the answer comes, subscribe and stay. 16 children were found in one room. The woman who gave birth to all of them was a child herself when it started. Whether that makes her a victim, a perpetrator, or both at once is the question this case cannot avoid any longer. I'll see you on the next one.